Good morning, everyone. My name is Christoph Wilke. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our dean for this event. But before doing that, I would like to say I'm very impressed by these rooms, by these new rooms, which are new to me as well. And I'm very excited that we are all here for such a great event, which is a joint event of the Institute for Ethics in AI and the think tank by the School of Social Science and Technology. So our institute has been working now for 3 years on ethics of AI in many different areas. We are located some blocks away from here, but we are very happy to be here today and have this very nice joint event. So without further ado, I will just hand over to Urs Gasser. Urs Gasser is the Dean of our School of Social Sciences and Technology. He's also Director of the Hochschule für Politik. And before coming to TUM as Professor of Public Policy, Governance and Innovative Technology, I did it. He served as the Executive Director of the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard and as a Professor of Practice at Harvard Law School. So we are very excited to have him here, to have us here, and the Institute and the think tank in this new location. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and good morning, everyone, and hello to everyone joining us online. It's a very cold morning here in Munich, and I think we hopefully heat up as we discuss global insights on AI governance with a wonderful team, great panelists today that they will introduce shortly. The game plan is to go on for an hour. Please feel free when you have questions and comments to weigh in. Just show your hand and I will draw you into conversation. This is meant to be highly interactive. It is meant to be a conversation, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all here. So how are you doing this morning on a Monday morning?
Yeah, good morning.
Good so far?
It's very cold, but yeah.
So Letizia Onchekwu, you're a computer science professor in Nigeria, and you're visiting Munich for the first time, or is this?
Yes, thank you for having me. I want to thank the organizers too for organizing this great event. This is my first time in Munich. I've come from Nigeria, from University of Port Harcourt. So my area is in artificial intelligence and machine learning. So that's my area. So we've been doing some work on machine learning, especially in the area of smart agriculture.
Right.
So that is actually where I'm going into, smart agriculture.
Right. And I was curious, as we introduce and get to know our panelists, can you share a little bit more? How can AI and machine learning help to increase food security and food safety? And what are some sort of the applications you're working on? Okay,
I and my research team, we are working on how you can use IoT and AI to do crop prediction, that's crop yield prediction. Okay, the idea behind it is because of the food insecurity, especially in Africa. In Africa, we have a lot of challenges when it comes to food insecurity. And that is, of course, caused by climate change, whether pest infestation, the weather condition. So these are some of the things that causes the food insecurity. So what we intend to do, or what we are doing, because we have already started the work, although we are still into it, what we intend to do, which other countries have also done, is to use IoT, Internet of Things, and AI. The IoT will be mounted in the farm to monitor what is happening in the farm. Example, it will monitor if there's a pest infestation. It will monitor the soil fertility to find out if the soil is fertile or not. It will also monitor if there's anything like disease in the crop, because the crop we are looking at maize and cassava, because maize and cassava is a staple food in Africa. So we want to see how we can use this system to predict the crop yield. By doing that, we develop an AI model AI model will be trained using the data that will be collected from the farm, because we need to get the data from the farm. Because it is not enough for you to go into collecting external data, because most times people in Africa, people work with external data. But the right data set to be used, the right data set we're supposed to use is the internal data, that the African data set that will now give you the right result that you want. So what we intend to do is to get this data set from the community where we intend to work. Get the data set, train these data sets, then deploy the system to the cloud, so that the farmers who are the end users can have access to what is happening in their farm by giving them Android phones. Those that don't have Android phones can also send SMS messages for them to monitor what is happening in their farm. And by doing that, it will increase the crop, it will help them to increase their crop yield, because they will not be able to know when there's a pest infestation in the farm. It will also enable them to know when to apply the right fertilizers to the farm. So that's the essence of using AI and IoT to improve crop yield.
I mean, what an amazing way to get us started, and I think it demonstrates the potential of all these different new technologies, and of course, especially of machine learning and analytics. But at the same time, you know, the way you were describing it, it seems to be a relatively complex ecosystem. So even in terms of technology, you were talking about IoT, right? We're talking about sensors. You mentioned machine learning and large data sets. You mentioned cloud computing. And then you also alluded to, well, and then we still need to work with SMS and text messages to reach people. So what are some of the challenges as you use such advanced technologies, obviously in a part of the world where we can't take connectivity for granted, right? So even basic internet connectivity may be a challenge. Where are the biggest roadblocks right now that you're running into?
Well, actually, we have challenges, okay, because you know the farmers, some of these farmers don't really have the money to buy some of the system, because they need to buy the system that's been developed. They need to buy it before they can make use of it. So there are challenges in terms of funding, in terms of buying the smartphone that they need to monitor what is happening in their farm. So what we intend to do is to kind of reduce the costs of getting this IoT system, because they need to get the IoT system that enable them to monitor what is happening. So we need to reduce the costs. And again, our government is we're also praying that the government will also do something, will also support some of these farmers, because they need to support them. And of course, we cannot, because of the fact that these things are expensive or they are not easy to come by, you can't just withdraw from using it, because there's need for us to use these systems to help the farmers and the end users. So I can't say that there are no challenges. There are challenges, quite all right, but these are challenges that can be overcome in terms of government coming in, okay, to assist even those that are developing and deploying this AI model. It's not easy, but if the government can fund these projects, then those at the grassroots can easily have access to the IoT devices and then the phones that they can use to monitor what is happening in the farm.
I see. So funding is the key.
Funding is the key. Yes, funding is the key element. So the government needs to come in to fund these projects, also to fund even the performers that need the devices. They need to also fund them, and they'll be able to use it. So funding is a key issue in Africa.
You know, I think it's good for us to hear and realize, because when we talk about AI and AI governance, we sometimes focus a lot on accountability and fairness and lots of issues that, of course, are important, as you pointed out as well. But there are also kind of fundamental enablers that need to be in place that we can unlock the potential of the technology, for instance, to enhance food security, as you pointed out. Now, speaking of government and what governments can do, I also know that you've been appointed to a commission that's currently in charge of drafting the Nigeria AI policy framework, and I'm not sure how much you can say about it, but what's your feeling? Is this going to be a helpful tool for the government to some sort of get a navigation aid in place, the way you just described it?
Yeah, well, recently, my government the National Information Technology Development Agency, NIDA, that's what they're called. They recently inaugurated a committee, okay, in Nigeria to produce the first AI policy, okay, that will be used to regulate the AI system and the AI system. So I happen to be a member of that committee. Okay, so we are working on developing the first AI policy that can be used by the AI developers. So right now we are still working. Last week, my team, we still met, so we're still meeting. So for now, I cannot really say anything until this thing is in place because the work is not yet over. But Nigeria has now embraced the fact that there's need for them to develop a policy that will be used to guide the developers of this AI system, because there's need for them to be guided. So you don't just develop, create and deploy AI system without following the policy that had been put in place by the government. So the government has actually inaugurated that, and I'm a member of that committee, and we're still working.
Excellent. So sounds like a big challenge is ahead.
Yes,
in
yeah,
crafting
it is.
these policies, and we'll return to that. So let's put a pin into the topic of policy, because when we come to Armando, I will ask you a bit more about the role of governments and policy. But so thanks for sharing some sort of your use case and perspective and important work. And I would like now to turn over to you, Liz, Dr. Liz Sylvan. Liz, you're the managing director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. We know each other quite well because I hired Liz back then, and Liz is fantastic. So it's so nice to have you here over in Europe.
I'm thrilled. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited to be on the panel, already learning, and so glad to be in Munich, yeah.
It's good to have you. And we will be on a panel twice together.
Yes.
Together. It's kind of a wonderful start
Yeah.
into a new week.
Yeah.
So Liz, you're of course running a center, and I know from own experience what it means. So we're usually thinly spread and doing many different things.
Yeah.
Yet you're an expert on education and educational technology and the use of technology in learning more broadly. And I was wondering, maybe as a second, some sort of context and use case now, maybe more from a North American perspective, what's happening right now when it comes to AI-based technologies? We take a broad definition here, and learning. What are some of the trends you're seeing? And what's happening in classrooms, in schools, but also more in informal places of learning when it comes to these advanced technologies?
Thanks. Yeah, well, it's something, as you know, I care a lot about. I think that there's a number of things going on in education right now. For one, we're sort of in this endemic phase of COVID where we're reflecting on all of the fast changes that we made during the pandemic, which was in the US an uneven but urgent switch to a lot of online learning. And that had is very different in different contexts. So there's no one educational system in the US really. Every state has their own implementation, and even towns or cities have their own implementation. So I can't say there's like one solution, the way in some countries there's one overall plan. But I think learning has absolutely changed. And people are using much more digital tools, even now back in the classroom. There's questions of we have sometimes school cancellations for snow, and people are saying, well, maybe we don't need to do that. We could just go switch to online learning. So there's a lot more thinking about hybridization. But all of the tools that are being used, or the vast majority of them, there are some exceptions, are tools that are not publicly funded. They're typically private organizations that have some requirements about what they have to share and do, but they're fairly limited. And there's a lot of stakeholders representing the young people. It's very hard for them to represent themselves. So there's teachers and administrators, and then there's people on the ed tech side, and they're all making decisions for young people. young people who will have data collected throughout their lives. So will be in fact more impacted than, probably anyone in this room will be. Certainly I will be, because I grew up before this all happened. And, the US recently, over the summer, had this blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And I can talk more about that generally. But just to say briefly now, it's a blueprint, it's non-binding, and it has some good ideas in it. And the president asked that every agency previous to this create some accountability for where they are. And, the Department of Education, which is the federal agency, did do some work, but they probably don't have the resources to do everything they would want to do in this space. And so a lot of the AI implementation that you would hope to see probably hasn't happened yet, but whether that's regulation or standards. So I think that there's a lot of work to do there. I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen for teachers, for administrators, for students themselves, and maybe also for policymakers about what needs to happen yet, because the stakeholders can't agitate or represent themselves, right? So others have to represent for them. And there's so much, we often talk about the risks. I'm sure we'll talk about risks and harms, which are incredibly important for populations who can't speak for themselves. But there's also tremendous opportunity for AI to really create personalized learning environments, for the personalized learning to not just be about this subject or this teacher or this grade, but throughout life. There's possibilities of changing how we assess, so we don't have to test so much, which is a bigger part of the US educational system than is ideal. So there, I think it's also about, we do have some regulation about privacy, but what I hear a lot of times from administrators and some of the work that I do and teachers is that they wish that they would be freed of those restrictions more, so they could use the data that's coming from these AI systems much more effectively. Because they would like to be able, they know it's there, they can see it's there, but it's not integrated in a way that they can use because all the tools are separate. There's really no motivation for the ed tech providers to integrate the information. And they don't have the perspective of lifelong learning because they have to be focused on the work in front of them, the classroom in front of them, the period in front of them, that hour, then the next hour, then the next hour. And someone else needs to be doing that work. And so I think it's incumbent on researchers and on policymakers and on, advocates to speak on behalf of young people.
Thank you, Liz. And I think there is already a common thread coming from two different contexts of application and very different geographies when it comes to the role of government, right? So on the one hand side, we've heard from Leticia that there is a need, an enabling role governments can play, and funding is of course part of it. I think you allude to a similar thing, right? That governments have to put guardrails into place, but also guardrails that enable, for instance, data usage and data sharing to unlock the promise of these technologies. And then there is the other role that you alluded to as well, particularly Liz, a constraining role where, yes, we need to have safeguards and we need to make sure that whatever data is collected and whatever predictive algorithms are deployed in the education field will not some sort of create unfair outputs. And there are stories from the UK and so forth. We've all seen how it can go wrong to use AI to predict admissions and things like that. So there's this dual role, and I'm wondering, Armando Guillo Español, it's to have your perspective. You have been involved in different roles as a researcher, but also actually working within the government and now assisting governments, particularly across Latin America, in developing AI policies. You've worked with institutions like the OECD. You have pioneered actually the AI ethics governance framework for Colombia, the country, yes. And so you've done a ton of work looking at some sort of best practices and the policy toolkits available and evidence-based policy making, and then translating it to some of these application areas we're talking about here. So what's your take? Can you share a little bit more? How do you see government's role in navigating this hard problem, right? There is all this promise of the technology, but there are also all these risks. And what can governments do actually to some sort of carefully balance these things while technology is developing rapidly, while we have pressing global problems where we need the best technology to solve it? So what can governments do in practice to work through that struggle?
Yeah, well, big question, and that's the question that we are still answering, I think. So from the Latin American perspective, I think we have been, as you mentioned, been looking into all these different practices around the world. Of course, that has been very helpful. The research at the same time, this kind of research from institutions, for example, we were very much aware of what the Berman has been doing in the last years. That was very helpful. Also, European entities, European research in different research institutions has been of great importance. But then I think countries need to decide at some point. Yeah, we can do a lot of research and look into different benchmarks and ideas, but then it comes the moment of deciding. And when we are talking about deciding, I think the strategy is always something good to work on, having a proper strategy and bringing a multi-stakeholder approach to the design of those strategies. That's mainly what we have been trying to improve a little bit more. The thing is that sometimes, and especially when we're dealing with public officials, we had a lot of, and we had been also discussing this a lot, information asymmetries and how policymakers, the knowledge they have about these technologies and the needs and all the, for example, data sets, all the information needed, how algorithms are designed, that's still something that I think public officials are not having proper information, and sometimes they are just having like very much an approach to this, even from a science fiction approach sometimes, and that's something we have been trying to work on, and that's where also the strategies and having this kind of national policies have been very helpful at the same time. So yeah, it's a matter of deciding what are going to be like the most important topics and perhaps elements of those strategies. So in the case, for example, of Colombia, where we work on this strategy, we decided to have 14 guidelines specifically that were about ethics, digital skills, governance, improving our research and innovation system. I think they were quite ambitious. We had the same problem, the funding, how to get all the funds to achieve that. But I think that still it was a good policy in the way that it was showing that it was not necessary just to have regulatory proposals or ethical frameworks, but at the same time, this had to be an holistic and comprehensive policy. And that has been followed by other countries. So we saw that also in Peru. We saw also that in Chile, following a little bit of what, for example, in that case, Colombia did. And that's mainly what we are trying to develop now, the second stage of phase of national strategies, because they cannot be the same strategies that were 2 or 4 years ago, for example. They have to be different strategies, very much implementation oriented. We believe that that has to be the main focus. And working on something that can be easily implemented, it's the main challenge with scarce resources, especially on very scarce resources that we have available, is the real challenge now. So that's how we're thinking about all these big ideas, how do we put them into the practice, and especially that they answer to the context of these countries, the funds available, the training, the asymmetries again. That's now the challenge we have, and that's what we have been working on. But I need these needs of this kind of collaboration. An example of collaboration for all of you to know is also like the expert mission that we have. We had this expert mission in Colombia, in which basically we were like, we have no idea like how we're going to deal with some strategic points of our strategy, especially on the future of work and talent. And that's where we decided to have these experts from all around the world. Professor Gasser was one of them that was invited by the President of Colombia to be part of this AI expert mission, and basically to help us to see what we can do and how we can easily implement something. From there, we have this idea of talent and a future work lab, basically a policy lab that was going to be mainly focused on working on these specific issues. That was something that the mission was very helpful about. And that's where I think we were also a little bit successful in Colombia about bringing these experts and bringing different stakeholders. Still, I think we could have done more, but that's just a country that has been, very honestly saying, a pioneer in the region and in the world, and that's where we, the starting point at least.
Thank you, Armando, for pointing out some of these almost meta challenges, right? So you mentioned particularly the problem of information asymmetry that runs across a number of dimensions. So governments and expert communities in research, but also, you know, different stakeholders that may have different levels of understanding. And Letizia, I was wondering, as you're a computer science professor and you work with young people, how do you think about this capacity problem, right? That the knowledge about AI and data is so unequally distributed, and yet we need many more people who have the literacy, the data literacy, and the basic understanding of technology to make sure that future decision makers in companies, in the government, are making the right choices, or at least informed choices, right? How do you see that? What's the role of a university? Do we need to start even earlier and focus on, you know, STEM education in K to 12? How do you think about this information asymmetry problem as an educator?
Thank you very much, Charles. For when it comes to that, there's need to create awareness. So I'm also looking at starting from the grassroots. Okay, we need to start from the grassroots to tell the people what AI is all about. But when you come to Africa, it's not everybody that knows about AI. So there's need to start from the grassroots to create the awareness so that people will know what AI is all about. And by doing that, people will also buy the idea, because they need to understand that this technology is here to help us to solve our problem. And even as it's solving the problem, it also comes with its challenges, the safety and so on and so forth, that that the developers also need to look at. So it is important that we start from the grassroots. We need to catch them young, explain this thing to them at the grassroots level. So by the time they get to the higher institution or tertiary level, from in my African perspective, they understand what AI is all about and they're able to embrace it. Then the government also needs to also do more in the area of trying to funding, because you find out that most projects that have to do with AI, people are there. We have smart people that can develop this AI system, develop and deploy them. But the challenge we have is funding, just like I said before. So most people seem to shy away from it, because you have the idea, you know what to do, but because there's no money, so they will not be able to come out to do what they intend to do when it comes to AI, to developing this system and deploying this system, because of funding. So it's good to start from the grassroots to create the awareness of time. Thank you.
So awareness raising and Armando mentioned also multi-stakeholder collaboration. So Liz, you've run at the Berkman Klein Center a number of experiments that are now more than experiments, research sprints, where you were essentially figuring out kind of a new format to increase capacity and awareness, if you will, among different stakeholders around AI topics. It's not specifically only AI, it's a broader framework. But how do you think about some sort of this capacity problem and also the inclusion problem I want to talk more about? You mentioned already in your introductory remarks that young people are sometimes not part of these conversations about the AI future we're building today and the decision we're making. So can you share a little bit more about some of these formats that you have been piloting at Berkman Klein that somehow raise awareness, that try to bring together different stakeholders, that create a learning environment around these AI issues, both as a matter of technology, because that's not straightforward, but then also when it comes to these larger governance questions that we touched upon?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate what you were saying, Leticia, about the sort of training and support that's needed and the funding that's needed. Or as you know, the research sprints very well, because you you were one of the original designers of that program, of course. And one of the things that was unexpected was COVID, and so we ended up doing a program that we didn't anticipate being entirely virtually, and it's actually fantastic because it opens the program up for people who couldn't otherwise attend. And we're sticking with that forever. We might change some things to get to gather people for shorter periods of time, but what we're able to do is we're able to invite participants from all around the world to be part of a program that's based on the support of many of our partners in the global network of centers who teach from different perspectives around the world. And we have learners from many places around the world. They can participate, they can connect with expert researchers, they do real projects, their outputs are always real projects they do in collaboration with other students in other places. And we build a tremendous amount of connection between the participants and, as much as possible, the experts. And what we hope and it's always within an ethical perspective, because I think that's another important part of how we're thinking about what AI should look like and what computer science should look like going forward, both. I see those as being not the same things, oversecting, but not overlapping, but not the same thing. And so what our hope is that over time, these sort of pretty high touch programs can be something that we help other centers to run themselves. We work on building more of a cohort and build up and support a new set of leaders who are from different places, who are connected to sort of powerful institutions, but are unafraid and to speak their voice, to bring in their academic understanding, their cultural perspectives, their learned experience, all of that, to what are problems that face us all and differentially impact populations not in the same way. And if we can't have these kinds of conversations, I don't see a path forward. So I think it's incumbent on those of us who are in positions who can affect change to invite others into the conversation, give them support. And actually we do provide a stipend, which I think matters in these contexts as well.
Thank you, Liz. And of course, I have two immediate follow-ups. One is to acknowledge that we have a graduate of the program sitting right here in the audience. Sorry for the cold call, Franziska, but who's an expert herself and contributed to the program tremendously. So this is the first time you meet face to face.
No.
Oh, you did know in Rio, yes,
yeah, that's
exactly.
right. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Well, so glad we can reconnect. And then, of course, Christoph, I also want to bring you into the conversation because your institute that is convening us here today is also developing an amazing collaborative multi-institutional program to share resources on AI ethics across the globe. Can you say a few words? It's all open access. It's available through your website. Can you share a few of the highlights of this program?
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. Since this is a very exciting project, I must say. So it's a project that we launched in 2019. Help me, Caitlin. I think it was in
It was 2020.
2020.
Anything feels longer. You're okay.
Yeah. So these are two things actually. So I think we may not mean the same. So we have the Open AI ethics course system that was opened and in collaboration with the GovLab at New York University in cooperation with our colleague Stefan Verhulst there. And this is a catalog of modules, online modules. This has grown over time. We are now at, I don't know, 50 lectures, 50 modules around that. And there is a really huge number of participants in these courses. It's fully open access, fully free, freely available on the internet for everyone to take. And we're adding new courses still. And so this is an ongoing project, has been running for years now. I take it that's what you.
That's correct. But you feel free to mention the other initiative as well.
Yeah, the other initiative is the Global AI Ethics Consortium, which is also, I think, a very important initiative. It was my idea to come up with something immediately when COVID broke out. I thought we should also, we should not wait patiently for things to come, but rather do something from our end and to bring people together in this way. And it has now a lot of members from around the globe, institutes as well as individuals who are part of this consortium, and we are using that as a network for example, submitting joint proposals to calls or to cooperate on a variety of projects actually. But now we are also going back to in person. So I think it started as an online, as a virtual project, but now we are going to have these conversations again in person, and we are going to our conference, for example, in Singapore at TOM Asia in next September with this consortium and others.
Great, thank you. So you see that there are various efforts on the way. We feature just those that we have some sort of in the house to build this capacity to address some of these information asymmetries, but also bring together different stakeholders. The way you highlighted, Armando, it is important. And at the same time, I think it's still helpful to remind ourselves occasionally, we're still early stage in AI development and deployment, right? So especially for those in the field, we like to point out, well, AI, we had discussions for many decades about AI. We had several winters and springs and summers and then winters again of AI. And yet, if you look at actually when the technologies have become relevant in our society and in our lives, that's a more recent development. And then if you look at frameworks that some sort of track cycles of technological innovation over time, like electricity or the railway system or the internet, you see that it takes roughly 50 years, 50 years, till one of disruptive technology of this sort actually gets some sort of embedded into society. So these are relatively long cycles, right? And so if you think about it, 50 years is quite a long time for a society to figure out how to use technology and build the ecosystems around it and adjust somehow and interact and shape and work with the technology itself, which of course is embedded in a social system to begin with. And so that also points, I think, to another question I have for you, Armando. So if that's correct, right, and we're still in early stages, if it's also correct that we have all these information asymmetries despite our collaborative efforts to build capacity and share knowledge and experiences, then it means decision makers, particularly policymakers, when crafting laws or ethics frameworks or national policies, have to decide under uncertainty. We don't have all the evidence, we're producing the evidence, but we don't have it ready to go. And so I know sometimes we call you a Mr. Sandbox, right? Because you have been pioneering sandboxes for AI, law and policy and ethics. Can you tell us a little bit more, how can we deal with this problem of not knowing and some sort of be strategic about it, bringing together some of the stakeholders and learn on the go, and maybe sandboxes are a way. Can you tell us a bit more about the sandboxes, Mr. Sandbox?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor No. So, yeah, sandboxes had been a great idea in this context because definitely it's allowing us to have an approach to technology, allowing governments to do something, to learn, because basically, as you mentioned, there's a lot of demand for action. Like, what are governments doing right now? Are they regulating? Are they looking into all these terrible risks about discrimination, biases, unfairness, and the use of AI? What are governments doing? Start doing something and then start limiting the use of this technology in some way. And then we got to this idea about, okay, let's see, because we're still on a very early stage of the technology. We're still learning a lot about it. How are we going to do something? And then is when we got the sandbox idea and project as a very good way of moving forward, showing that we can perhaps learn more, but at the same time that there is some action in place. Yeah? And the good thing I really like about sandboxes is that if they are embedded into a whole regulatory agenda or at least on a policy about AI or technology, because if you just have sandboxes for the sake of sandboxes, that will not work. So what we did, for example, in the case of Colombia, was to have the AI strategy, and we say, okay, we need to address the governance regulatory question. What are we going to do there? The answer was, let's try to address this from an experimentation perspective and approach. And that was basically very new for the country. Like, what are you talking about here? Like, a lot of people say, are you experimenting with the law? What are you going to do? What about the rule of law? Yeah, you can not experiment with that, perhaps with the technology, but not with the law. And that was very ambitious of the Colombian strategy, I think, but I think it worked. And it was this idea of, we're going to experiment, and we're going to experiment with sandboxes. Yeah, and we have seen sandboxes on the financial sector, but we want to take them into other sectors, and from there build a policy on how to have this very much regulatory experimentation to improve and to obtain more evidence on the technology, the risks, and from there make some more informed regulatory decisions. And that's how it started. It's part of a policy. Then it mobilized a lot of different entities. And then we got one of the first sandboxes in Latin America on AI, not the first one on AI specifically, on the privacy by design and by default by the Data Protection Authority. So we were able to convince this authority, which it has been known as being very conservative on its approach to regulation and technology, to try to prove a sandbox, yeah? And to try to have this sandbox in a way of understanding the real consequences for data protection of the use of some AI systems. And I think that was a great way of learning. I think that it was a good way of putting also together all these stakeholders. So bringing them together, creating this idea of trust, of sharing information, that's very much important on this. And I think that it was in some ways successful in the point that the Data Protection Authority changed many of their previous ideas thanks to this sandbox. So, for example, they were thinking about having a guideline on data protection, which was basically, following a lot of ideas, but without the proper evidence. So they were talking about, for example, having, minimization, data minimization as a principle. That was going to be part of the data protection regulation in Colombia. But when you look into the technology and how data and more data can even help to accuracy and have better results and avoid many of the setbacks of discrimination or biases, then they enter into this idea, okay, we'll still need to learn a little bit more. Yeah? And that's how sandboxes are helping us to navigate this uncertainty, is showing that governments are doing something, is showing that we are aware of this. And I'm really looking forward for especially developing countries to develop this kind of approach, because I really want them to have their own evidence and their own experience, especially when they're facing all these international proposals, the AI Act here in Europe, of course, the Bill of Rights, a lot of the geopolitics moving there on the regulatory scope also. What about developing countries? What about our own proposal for the regulation of these technologies? How do we build that? From this kind of sandbox experience, gathering our own evidence, gathering our own knowledge on this, and that's where the sandboxes, I think, have been helpful. They are not perfect. They cost a lot. They also need funding, but that's where we're trying to move. And I'm happy to say that Chile is taking the lead on the sandboxes. They want to develop this very big sandbox on AI in the country, on very big systems. They are thinking about an environmental sandbox, or perhaps a transportation sandbox, especially on autonomous vehicles in Santiago. Like they have this big project that they would like to move forward. I'm going to be involved there. Hopefully the TUM think tank is also going to be part of this, and all of you. So there I can gain my Mr. Sandbox. Yeah, so that's experience with the sandboxes, and hope to have more of the Brazilians, also the data protection authorities also very interested about having them. And I think it can be a good way to navigate, as we said, this uncertainty and this need for doing something right now.
Yeah. Thank you, Armando. So the way you also describe the landscape is that we learn from each other, right? And sandboxes are, of course, one way to learn from different stakeholders, and as things get more concrete and as the use cases get more real. But it also suggests that there is some sort of international discourse and international debate going on. What are the appropriate safeguards? What are best practice and policies? And Leticia, if I may ask you, what are the places that your country is looking towards to get inspiration for the kinds of policies you're drafting? We know, of course, there are now dozens, if not hundreds, of policies around the world on AI, and we didn't talk about China yet, right? Where are some sort of, where do you see the intellectual influences when it comes to policy in Nigeria in particular?
Well, when it comes to the development of the AI policy in Nigeria, like I said, we've just started, but they were looking at different contributions from different areas, like UNESCO, for example. You know, there's one that was there's this regulation that was presented by UNESCO. So they are also looking at that. They're looking at the one that they can pick from there, because we need to develop this AI policy so that it can conform to our own society. So it's not just they're not just picking. They're not just going to use what has been presented to them, but they will use it in such a way that it will help Nigerians and our culture, our different diversities supposed to align to it. So they actually got other people's ideas and policies. So that's what they are using to guide them to produce to guide us, because I'm part of that team, to guide us to produce the first AI policy for the country. So that of UNESCO was actually one of the documents that we are using, because during the development of that UNESCO's own, the Nigerian government was part of it. So we were part of that team that we are part of the team actually that attended that of UNESCO before they now sent it out for different countries to look at it and then use it as a guide to produce their own AI policy. So we are looking at different countries' policies. That's going to help us, and it's going to serve as a guide to produce that of Nigeria.
Very, very important. And I would like to follow up on that theme, but I'm also aware of time. Now would be a good time to, if you have questions or comments, to raise your hand, and I will weave you into the conversation. So please let me know. Yes, please.
Yes. I have a question about what's your observation just in general about the role of private sector companies in sort of co-shaping the AI landscape, because you've mentioned that not all regions have the same governance and power dynamics. And you know, sometimes government use tech exactly to exert a level of control, and then private sector loves data. They will invest, we talk about funding, so they might invest where the business models already work for them. So with multi-stakeholder setup, but with all the stakeholders having different interests, what might be the trickier points that you've seen to avoid sort of AI policy framework being a tick boxing exercise?
I think that it's a great question, and Liz, you already alluded to it when describing the EdTech space, that, you know, there is, yes, a government agency responsibility, but we have many private companies entering the space. How do you think about this tension and this potential problem?
I mean, at a baseline, I think we need more regulation. So I think we just We just need more regulation, so.
In the US, you mean?
In the US,
Not
yeah.
in Europe.
But we need, so, and I think, you know, since so many tech companies are, you know, founded in the US, it needs to happen there. So just sort of start with that and then I'm gonna say other things, but that still stands. I think that we also need to, when we need to have all these conversations, and when we do, we have to do it in such a way that we can really listen to one another, understand perspectives, and find mutual solutions that work. Because if you try to do everything in a winner takes all or adversarial context, you will remain stuck. And we have seen, speaking for the US, we've seen a lot stuck. When I've talked with administrators and tech providers together, there is actually, school administrators, a lot of common ground, a lot of belief in wanting to think about how to work better for kids. I think if, for example, we invested in some standards in the US, that could probably be very helpful to get to sort of the sort of longer term issues. I think if we do have some privacy legislation, but if we could think about how to center the agency of data on the values and needs of, in this case, young people, but in any case, any data subjects, that would also be extremely helpful. You know, I think that means that everyone has to kind of show up at the table. And I think this is certainly a role for academic environments to play as being a place where people are willing to show up together. So legislators, people in the tech fields, yeah.
I think you're making an interesting point in addition to responding to your question, right, about the balance and capture and the interests of big tech. You're also making the point, big tech that we are talking about is mostly coming out of the US for the types of technologies we're using here. Again, there is a China story,
Yeah.
It's more complex, so we leave that for another panel. But then there is also, I think there is a real question too, and Laetitia, I'm wondering about that. So, you know, some of our colleagues argue we're at the beginning maybe of a new form of colonialism, which is data colonialism and tech colonialism, because we are crafting business models, we are crafting technologies, we are producing and exporting things to other parts of the world without necessarily having the sort of participation that you highlighted in the UNESCO example, right, where there was at least representation, and Armando was actually part of the Colombian delegation. So focusing for a second on the role of companies, that could also be a positive story about the power of the private sector, for instance, by creating ecosystems of entrepreneurship that are local, that are not driven by Silicon Valley values and logic, whether it's Ubuntu ethics or inspired by other frameworks. So in Nigeria, how would you describe some sort of the entrepreneurial space when it comes to some of these advanced technologies? Is that an ecosystem that's in the making that you think policy is also trying to support, or what's the role of companies as you see it?
Well, in Nigeria, a lot of companies are also using technology. That's private companies that have developed their own technology and they are using it. For example, we have that case of Innocent Motor, that is an indigenous company, a private company that have developed their assemble parts, that's car parts. So that's their own technology. So there are a lot of the banking industry too in Nigeria. A lot of banking industry that have developed their own AI system that they are now using only to solve Nigerian problem. For example, we have that of Roku. Roku is a private company, it's a private bank, and the technology, the AI system they are using to solve their problem was developed by a Nigerian. We have a lot of these AI systems that are developed by Nigeria that they are also using, despite the fact that we don't have the AI policy yet. Okay, they develop this system, they deploy them, and they use them. So Nigerians are actually trying, because we have a lot of these indigenous systems that have been developed by Nigeria, especially even in this health sector. We have these AI systems that are being used in the health sector, even in agriculture. But the only thing is that the level that we ought to be in, we have not actually gotten to that level. But when it comes to indigenous systems, indigenous technology that have been developed by Nigeria, we have a lot of them. But there are even some that they have developed in Nigeria, but because of funding, they've not been able to finish such projects. So it's also part of the problems that we have. So despite the fact that this AI policy has not been, we're still working on it, we have not actually started implementing it. We have people that are smart, that are good in developing these AI systems. Developed and have deployed these systems in Nigeria. Super. Especially when it comes to health sector, the agriculture sector, the industry, the banking sector. We have a lot of AI systems that are being used there.
Fascinating. So as we're approaching 10 o'clock Munich time, I think we get the feeling that there's so much in flux, right? We have, in a way, a conversation about the policy space, the role of government, but then also talked about, well, the responsibility of the private sector, including some of the challenges. We were talking a little bit about what mechanisms do we have available to bring stakeholders together, whether it's in academic centers and settings as a facilitator, whether it's sandboxes as a tool in the toolkit of governments. We also highlighted some of the persisting problems, in addition to information asymmetries, the question of participation gaps, funding, of course, as a core theme throughout, the question of what safeguards do we need in place, do we have too much, too little law, the wrong sort of law. So it's really a space in flux, and I think what Laetitia just shared with us is also kind of giving reason for hope, right? That there are local, there's innovation happening, there's an increased awareness, a word you used, around these technologies and how we can really shape them, that they benefit humanity. And as things are complicated in that sense, I'm wondering for a final round whether you're optimistic about the AI future or pessimistic or both. So Liz, are you optimist, pessimist, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an optimist by nature, but I'm somewhere in between. I think that there's such potential. I think there are things that are really frightening to me, and yet, you know, I see so many people who are trying to come from an ethical framework, really trying to work with others to figure out paths for success. I'm inspired by, the work of others on the panel, for example. So I'm cautiously optimistic, I would say.
Thank you, Liz. Armando, optimist, pessimist?
No, I think, yeah, I'm optimistic that we're doing some work. There are people in the field working on this, so that's make me to increase my optimism. But still, I'm a little bit afraid of all the things that are going on so fast, the technologies that we are not able to catch up, especially if you're talking about some context in some countries. Of course, we always are afraid of perhaps this being a second lost opportunity, or third, as we call it, because we have seen this as the fourth industrial revolution. So this idea there are a lot of expectations, especially in Latin America, about this new revolution changing our context, changing our countries. And we are a little bit afraid that we are losing this one again because we were not that prepared. We were not in the first, on the front of the technology. So I'm afraid of that, the expectations not being met, and that people then get tired of all this technological change and just see the technology also as an enemy. So hopefully we're able to answer to those expectations in a way in which this also brings some social prosperity and change for the countries. That's what is keeping me optimistic. Yeah,
that's the mission.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I'm actually optimistic because I believe that AI has come to stay, but the developers need to be careful. There should be trust, okay? Because in as much as this technology has come to help us, it also has its own, its own issues that the government needs to come into. Because if the government is not able to come in, there's no AI governance, then this AI technology can actually fail. So there's need for for government to come in, and there should be accountability and trust, especially trust. There should be trust, make the people to believe in this technology, because this technology can fail. But I'm optimistic that AI it has actually come to stay. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. On a less serious note, there is another reason why it's meaningful to be optimistic. Pessimists may be right in the end, but the optimists have more fun along the way. So thank you for the conversation.